Thank you.
Take the floor.
I needed to call out just a few people here. My spouse and full-time public relations professional pro bono for this project, who's been just super, helped me get through the whole process. Also, I need to call out Greg Belote. Greg was tremendously helpful in the editing and rewriting of this book, and I owe him a big debt. Paula Patch, who a little over 5 years ago made the decision that maybe an old dog could learn a few new tricks. I hope she hasn't come to the point where she's regretting that decision. but here she sits today. Also, Ben Rogers, who's in my English 110 class. Ben, in spite of the fact that Ben is first semester, first year, he already knows that he wants to be a teacher. And I'll tell you the same thing about him I told his parents, which is when he does embark on his career, there are going to be a lot of lucky students out there. And Prudence Lane, who after my first department meeting in 35 years, was kind enough to come up and introduce herself. I think I was looking a little shell-shocked. It was a dramatic meeting, as you recall, probably.
I don't even remember.
Yeah. But she was kind enough to introduce herself, and we've been friends since. And of course, Rosemary, one of my Haskell, one of my colleagues here in the department. Charles Irons and I are sons of old Virginia. We could break into the good old song, but probably everybody would scurry for the doors, Charles, so we'll wait till another venue for that. And then, of course, Megan, who was my sweet office mate and put up with my shenanigans for a couple of years without complaint. And again, thanks to you ladies for coming and for putting this together for us. So, do we want to do the trailer first? This is, I didn't know until July that there were such things as book trailers. So I'm going to just indulge in, since you're having a nice lunch, indulge in a little unabashed self-promotion. This runs for 3 minutes, 40 seconds. gives you some background on the novel. So I thought I would start with sharing my Oprah Winfrey moment with you. What had happened was I had been researching the novel for more than a year, and had written about a third of it. And I took one day and just went back over the manuscript, and I found that somehow, and this is not to say anything negative about history books, Charles, but as I was reading the manuscript, it just sounded like a history lesson to me. I think what had happened was I had done so much research and knew so many details, and I was trying to get so much of it into the manuscript that it just wasn't working. I was worried about it. And then but I felt good about the characters, and I felt good about the story. I felt there was something powerful there. And so, indulging in adult fantasy, I asked myself, well, let's just say in your wildest dreams, let's just say that Oprah Winfrey did take interest in this book. Let's just say she did. And let's say she decided to interview you. So what might she ask? And I thought, well, she'd probably ask, what would an educated, relatively privileged, white, 65-year-old man possibly have to say about the inner mind and heart of a 12-year-old, uneducated, impoverished black girl in 1912? So I pondered that question, and it seemed the only reasonable response was to say, well, Ms. Winfrey, not very much. So that set me out in search of, I think maybe instinctively I felt I needed it all along. I felt I needed a witness to the events. So who would have access to not only the black girl, but also to the halls of power, to the legislature, to the businessmen, to the governor's mansion for that matter? And so it hit me that I had found in my research that there was one white journalist in Virginia who had covered the case, had actually, after the girl was convicted, had actually interviewed her where she confessed to the crime. It was printed in the newspaper, much to our attorney's chagrin since they had an appeal in place. And his name was Charles Mears. It was on a court affidavit. And I found Charles Mears in the 1910-1911 yearbook called Colonial Echoes of William and Mary College. And so that's the picture of the young guy that you see up there. Mears was, he led his prayer group on Saturday nights. He was a member of the Temperance Society. He was a devout Methodist, but he is remembered by his classmates as being, quote, the most likely to bum tobacco, end quote. So my Charlie Mears is devout, he is earnest, and he is a chain smoker. So that brings me to the hard part of the presentation, because I need to ask you to imagine. I'm going to read a section from the book, and I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are not listening to me, but you're listening to an 18-year-old newspaperman in 1912. So I brought along a little prop, which maybe will help. My wife says it makes me look older, which is nearly impossible to believe. But I tell her that I think it makes me look like Robert Redford in The Sting.
That's pretty cool.
So I'm Charlie Mears. Chapter 17, So Long. The morning air on the street was humid. I could feel beads of sweat on my upper lip. Ahead, the Virginia State Penitentiary loomed dark and grotesque in the early light. I decided to have a smoke before I went inside. At the entrance, a Hacksaw Flour Mills freight wagon was parked, a big pair of mules standing in harness. The mules flicked their ears and switched their tails at flies. Two Negroes in floppy hats and overalls were unloading oak staves from the wagon onto a handcart. Their shirts were stained with sweat. One man came forward to the wagon seat and pulled two burlap feed sacks from under it. He draped a sack over the face of each mule. He paused as I struck a match. "Morning, sir," he said. "Doggone flies about to eat the eyes plumb out of them mules' heads." "Morning," the man at the cart said. "Good morning," I said. "Got one for a colored man, sir?" the first man asked. "Sure," I said, tipping the pack. The man took the lucky and smelled it. "That's some fine, rich tobacco right there," he said, tucking the cigarette between his lips. I struck another match. The man cupped my hand to his face. "Will you have one?" I said to the man at the cart. "Why, thank you, sir. I don't mind if I do. Hot already, ain't it?" He took the cigarette and placed it behind his ear. "I'm going to save mine," he said. "Bet you here to see the colored girl they're going to electrocute tomorrow. I seen you here before, ain't that right?" the first man said. I realized I had the press tag tucked above the bill of my cap. "Yes," I said. "Heard a white man say back during the trial, say they going to burn that girl or they going to burn the town of Hampton. What that man say?" "Her attorneys did their best," I said, given the circumstances. The man smoking said, "Them attorneys don't matter. Jury neither. That colored girl killed a white woman in her own house. Say her children even seen it." "Well," I said, "her daughters found her corpse." "Don't matter. Seen it, found it," the man in the cart said. "How old them girls anyways?" "One's 8. The older girl is 13. "Lord," the first man said, puffing smoke, "it's a good thing they gonna burn her. Else it'd be they gonna burn us, is how it is. That colored girl don't amount to no more than a dog." "The governor can change her sentence," I said, "even today. He could grant clemency." The two men looked at me quizzically. "How old you is, sir? You don't mind me asking," the first man said. 18. "Well then, sir," he said, "see, Governor Mann now, he done fought in the war. I just don't see him being the governor. What you say, sir, what the governor gonna grant?" "Clemency," I said. "You two gonna jawbone tomorrow morning, or you gonna unload this wagon?" Another colored man was walking briskly from the prison entrance. He wore the same floppy hat as the other men. His face was stern. "Them trustees got hoops waiting on the shop line," he said. "You Negroes best get the move on." "Yes, sir, boss, we working," the man in the cart said. "Just stop to catch us a breath." The two men fell back to unloading the staves. "Morning," I said to the third colored man, flipping my cigarette butt beyond the curb. "Morning, sir," he said, and nodded. "Your wagon?" I asked. "Yes, sir, and they expected me to show with a load of finished barrels at the mill today. Of course, these Negroes here, they ain't studying none of that." "I hope you make it before the rain," I said. "You're right about that, sir. Hot as it is, I expect we get us some storms before noon." He took off his hat and wiped his brow. "I better get inside," I said. "Good day to you, sir," he said. "Good day to you." I signed in at the guard station at the main gate and started down the walk. I stopped before I was in sight of the next station. Maybelle had made a little lemon cake about the size of my hand and iced it with chocolate. It was wrapped in wax paper. I removed it from my breast pocket and tucked it under my cap. "Here to see the little colored girl, Charlie?" the guard said. "Reckon this'll be the last." He grinned. He had a pinched face and pasty skin. His hair was black, and so were his eyes. The ends of his mouth turned down. "Stand by the cage." He patted the pockets of my jacket and trousers and ran his hands down my legs to my ankles. "All right then," he said. He led me up the flight of stairs to a corridor. At the end was Virgie Christian's cell. The cell door swung open and Mrs. Bradley, the matron, emerged. She was holding a tray. I'll check with you later, Virgie, she said, looking back in the cell. She had a big ring of keys at her waist. The keys rattled as she reached for the ring. Then she saw me. Why, good morning, she said. Virgie, look who's here. Ain't them preachers again, is it? Virgie asked. Lord, child, no. They won't be here till evening. It's your friend Charlie, the newspaperman, come to see you. Mrs. Bradley was a big woman, and her skirts about filled the corridor. Her face was heavy and dull, but her gray eyes were kind. She had her hair braided and set in a tight bun atop her head. Her big skirts rustled as she moved back to let me in the cell. She closed the door and locked it. Just an hour, Charlie. That's all today, she said. The springs on the cot squeaked as Virgie moved to make room for me. They squeaked again when I sat down. We listened to the footfalls as the matron and guard made their way down the corridor. The door at the end of the hall clanged shut. Virgie's cell was dark, but the death chamber across the hall was lit. A man wearing a blue cap and mechanic's overalls was working on an electrical connection on the chair. His elbow hit the enameled chamber pot underneath. It clanked against one of the legs. Virgie started at the sound, and so did I. The man moved the pot back in place and continued with his work. The arms and back of the chair were oak, and they looked golden in the light. I looked at Virgie as she watched. Her face did not move. Her breathing was steady. When the workman finished what he was attending to, he picked up his carpenter's tray and went out the opposite door of the chamber. He cut off the light. Mabel made you something, I said, for your birthday. Virgie stirred. Miss Harriet's too, she said. You remember to get her a present, Mr. Charlie? Yes, I said. I lifted my cap, exposing the flat parcel atop my head. I put my cap on the cot. Well, I said. Well, what? I nodded and the parcel fell into my hand. Birthday cake. I handed the parcel to her. More like birthday pie, she said. She folded back the wax paper. The chocolate icing had stuck and the lemon cake was mush. She grinned. Look awful good, Mr. Charlie. She laughed out loud, then dipped a finger. I laughed and dipped a finger too. Mabel was a genius. The cake was delicious, even wilted. What did you get Miss Harriet? She asked. A book of poems, I said. Mr. Charlie, you got to give up on them books. You get her some flowers or candy, something nice. All right, I said. I'll get some flowers too. She dipped in the cake again and licked icing from her finger. My mama liked her chocolate. She make her a cake, chocolate through and through, chocolate icing too. Mama sure could make her a cake before she got paralyzed. She paused. Mama, a high-toned woman. You said you seen her, Daddy the dark one. You seen him too. Seen I take after my daddy. He gonna come back this evening, matron say. She dipped her finger in the cake. I ain't thought about that. I ain't gonna see my mama no more. She smacked her lips and licked a finger. Tell you the truth, I kind of forgets what she looks like. Mama's sitting in the light just right, though. Her eyes turn green. Funny what you remember, she said. I took another dip of cake, then licked the icing from my fingers. I wanted a cigarette. I looked across the hall into the darkened room. I don't think I really remember Fitz, I said. I have a picture, and I take it out and look. I reckon it's the picture I remember now. I brought it here for you, Virgie. It's a present. I wanted something special. I pulled the photograph from my pocket. This is Fitzhugh Scott. We called him Fitz. She lifted a fold of her skirt and carefully wiped each of her fingers. Then she took the picture from my hand. It was curled with the humidity. She cradled it in her palm. Why, he looked like he gonna be President of the United States, she said. Yes, I said. He did. I'm gonna put this in the Bible them preachers brung me, she said. Thank you, Mr. Charlie. She reached under the cot, slid out the Bible, and placed the photograph under the front cover. She closed the cover and slid the Bible back. Are you afraid? I asked. She shook her head. You're brave. She began to fold the wax paper. I ain't brave. I just ain't afraid. I was afraid, I said. You mean with your friend? Yes, she said. Things might have been different. Things just is, Mr. Charlie. That's all I know. She folded the wax paper into a lumpy square. Your birthday coming up too, ain't it? Yes, the 21st. She said. Me and Harriet and you. Guess folks get mighty busy, cold weather coming on. She grinned. Oh, I said. Mr. Charlie, I believe you blushing. You knows what I'm talking about, don't you? She giggled. Is you blushing? I reckon I am, I said. She giggled again. We sat quiet for a while. Do you want to pray, Virgie? She shook her head slowly. No, Mr. Charlie, I don't, to tell you the truth. Them preachers gonna come back this evening and pray me straight up to heaven and back again, just like they've been doing every night this week. All right, I said. The wax paper rattled as she folded it once more and handed it to me. I placed it in my cap. It's not just the preachers, Virgie, I said. Think of the people who care about you, people who've written the governor, traveled to meet with him, people from all over Virginia, from Atlanta and Boston and Chicago, lawyers and editors, businessmen and teachers, school children. They've all asked the governor to spare your life. Even Mrs. Terrell took the train straight from the meeting of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, delivered their petition to the governor's hand, and visited you right here in this cell. She's one of the most prominent colored women in the country, Virgie, one of the most prominent women in the world, and she came right here to see you. Virgie said. That high-toned woman come waltzing in here in her button shoes and ruffles and feathers, wouldn't even sit down, afraid she'd get her dress dirty. She passed for white any day she wanted, Mr. Charlie. She ain't no negress like me. I's black as coal. She helped Virgie. Because of her, the governor granted the reprieve. Maybe he'll grant another. There's still time. I don't want no more time, Mr. Charlie, she said. I wants to go. What girl would want to live a life in here? Maybe one day you'd be paroled, Virgie. It happens. You can't give up. Oh, Mr. Charlie, you always so good. But for an educated white boy, you don't know much. She folded her hands in her lap. Let's just pass time, Mr. Charlie, like we do. Let's do the alphabet you taught me. Abel, boy, Cass, dog, easy, fox. I cleared my throat. George, have, item, jig. King, love, Mike, Nan, oboe. What oboe again, Mr. Charlie? A musical instrument. These are my favorites, she said. Pup, quack, rush, sail. Tear, unit, vice, watch. X-ray, yoke, Z. What Z again? The Greek letter for Z. Dog, Abel, dog, dog, yoke. Daddy. He said he coming one more time, Mr. Charlie. Say he got the money for the train. She turned and looked out into the hall. Stop that, Mr. Charlie, else you gonna get me crying too. I wiped my face with my hands. A door clanged at the far end of the hall. We listened to the footfalls. I picked up my cap and snugged it to my head with the folded wax paper inside. Fitz thought it was like this, Virgie. He said after this life, you're on a road traveling, and sometimes you stop and wait for your friends to catch up. She grinned. That why you brung me that picture, Mr. Charlie? So I know Mr. Fitz when I sees him? I hadn't thought that, Virgie. I just wanted you to have it. Well, me and Mr. Fitz, we're going to hide by that road, Mr. Charlie, and when we sees you coming, we're going to jump out and scare the sweet Jesus out of you. She laughed, bending forward. Her black eyes shone. She laughed again and shook her head, catching her breath. That's what we're going to do. It's time, Charlie, Mrs. Bradley said. She put the key in the cell door and pushed it open. I stood up from the cot. Virgie looked at me. Her face was beaming. She held out her hand. So long, Mr. Charlie, she said. I'll be seeing you. I took her hand and shook it. Her fingers were warm. Virgie, so long, I said. I turned and pushed through the cell door. I started to trot down the hall. Behind me, I heard the keys rattling. I trotted faster. Charlie, Miss Bradley called. Wait, I have to unlock that one. I slammed into the steel door and pressed my cheek against it. I clutched at the latch. My throat clenched tight. I felt Mrs. Bradley's hand on my shoulder. I stepped back and saw tears running down her face. We've done all we can do, Charlie, she whispered. She banged her key into the lock. She opened the door and closed it after me. I turned and looked back through the grate. Thank you, I said. She nodded and wiped her cheek. Then she was gone. Outside, the air had become hotter and even more oppressive. The men with the freight wagon were gone. I pulled off my cap and threw the wax paper by the curb. I put the cap on and pulled it down to shield my eyes. I looked up at the 3 big cupolas of the penitentiary. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. I looked at the curb. Next to the wax paper were cigarette butts and a pile of dung the mule had left. There were splinters from the oak staves. I started for the trolley stop. I had already taken a seat before I realized I'd boarded the blackball car. There were 2 passengers. A lithe, pretty, high-toned girl dressed in a prim black uniform stared at me, annoyed. Then she looked out the window. She was carrying a white, crisply starched apron and capped with ties that fluttered in the air from the window. The other passenger was a grizzled black man in a wide straw hat. He dozed, nodding with the motion of the trolley. His patched denim overalls were clean and freshly ironed. I looked out the window too. Not much had been left standing in this part of Richmond after the Union's selling. President Lincoln himself came to see the city the day after it fell. When they heard the news, colored people lined his passage, pressing forward to touch his coat. Well, it was the progressive South now. Governor Mann was a Democrat, and he'd helped his fellow Virginian Wilson to the Democratic nomination for the presidency. There were factories and trains. There were mills and forges. There were bridges and mines. There was scientific agriculture. The new Constitution had cut the voting population of the Commonwealth by half, nearly all of those removed colored. Jim Crow danced in polling places, courts, civil and criminal, restaurants and diners, trolley cars and passenger trains. He would dance at the penitentiary tomorrow morning. The maid and gardener moved toward the door as the trolley slowed. I kept my seat, pushing my glasses up my nose. I smiled as they passed. The young woman averted her eyes while the old man smiled and nodded. "A good day, sir," the gardener said. I nodded in return. I stood up and followed him down the steps. I was at the Main Street station. The boarding call for the Tidewater train echoed from the platform. Governor Mann had asked Commonwealth's Attorney Montague to review Virgie's case for error. He had ordered Warden Wood to give the girl a physical examination to determine she was of adult age. He had denied petitions for clemency from the girl's attorneys, Newsom and Fields. He had rejected appeals for mercy in letters from colored and white politicians, school teachers, businessmen, suffragettes, children's welfare groups, pastors, temperance society leaders, Chicago newspaper editors. He had informed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that he did not object to their hiring a private investigator to turn up new facts in the case. He notified a group of concerned physicians in Chicago that while they were free to send an alienist to determine the girl's mental competency, he was satisfied of her intelligence. He had met with William Habeas Corpus Anderson, attorney for prize fighter Jack Johnson, at the governor's mansion. He had listened politely to the colored attorney's points, but advised Anderson he was not sufficiently informed of the facts of the case. He had dismissed a notarized plea from the girl's father, signed with an X, saying that his child had never been a problem to anyone. He had responded by letter to a note penciled on floral notepaper from her crippled mother, begging him to spare her daughter's life. "I am always sorry to see anybody get into trouble," the governor wrote to Mrs. Christian. He dismissed my letters where I argued Virgie's confession clearly showed the murder was not premeditated and that life imprisonment was a harsh and sufficient punishment. Having once been a sitting judge, Governor Mann had reviewed the case himself in point of law. A minister, he prayed fervently about the morality of the sentence. In the end, I believe he felt her execution was inevitable. I watched the fields and towns and streams pass outside the train window. The sun bleached everything. When the cars pulled into Hampton, Poindexter spotted me from the platform. He pumped me with questions about my visit. I told him I couldn't talk because I had a deadline. At the trolley stop on Lincoln Street, a colored woman was selling dahlias, ones with big faces painted the colors you would see on carnival clowns. I asked her to pick out the best ones for a birthday present. "Now, is they for your mama or for a pretty young girl?" she asked, "'cause that make a difference." "A pretty young girl," I said.